In his book entitled The General, William Booth, Volume 2, author David Bennett shares how the founder of the Salvation Army felt about ministry after losing his sight. Bennett writes, William Booth was greatly stirred by the needs of the poor of London and realized that most churches were doing nothing to reach the undesirables. At that time, that was considered the drunkards, the morphine addicts, prostitutes, and the poor. He set out to reach them with what he called the 3 S's: soup, soap, and salvation. Thousands were saved among those that most churches had no interest in reaching. Booth gave his life for the cause of reaching others, hence the creation of the Salvation Army. But in his 80s, Booth's work began to be hindered by blindness. He briefly lost his sight and then recovered it, but later on he lost his vision permanently. His son Bramwell came to bring him the bad news that he would never see again. Booth replied, God must know best, Bramwell. I have done what I could for God and the people with my eyes. Now I shall do what I can for God and the people without my eyes. In our story for today, Jesus is ministering to a man who was born blind. While in entirely different scenario than what Dr. Booth had to deal with at the end of his life, this story speaks to both sides of having sight and being blind. There are both physical and spiritual considerations to be made with both, and Jesus will help us navigate this rather treacherous road. There's an old saying that I used as the title for our message today, Seeing is Believing. The question for us, as it was for those gathered around Jesus, is which sight will we use? As we will see, Jesus will focus on our spiritual sight. And to fully understand it, he starts by examining the meaning of belief. You see, we are going to be speaking today and listening about spiritual blindness, a topic that I think is very timely for the world that we are living in. But before we can grasp what spiritual blindness is, we need to go back to the beginning of the story. Jesus and his disciples are back on the move, we read at the beginning of chapter 9. Jesus and they come across a man who had been born blind. The disciples ask not only a religious question, but also the cultural question that one would expect at this time. When they say, Rabbi, who sinned? This man or his parents, that he was born blind? You see, that was the prevailing thought of the day, that suffering was attributed to sin. Jesus tells his disciples that neither the man nor his parents were to blame, as we see in verse 3. In verse 3, Jesus tells them, neither this man nor his parents sinned, said Jesus, but this happened so that the works of God might be displayed in him. You see, Jesus shifts the attention from the cause, which I think too often that's where we have a tendency to lie, which was sin, to the purpose, which was God's opportunity to act. This is important because it shifts the entire discussion of this chapter. Over the next 33 verses, we see how the crowd responds and how the Pharisees investigate. Which brings us to this final section of chapter 9. The reading in the lectionary is all 41 verses. That would take me at least 2 or 3 sermons. I wanted to focus in at the end because I think this is an area that we entirely forget. It's always at the end of stories. Have you ever felt that when you read a book? You get to the very last few paragraphs, maybe the book, and you close it and say you're done, right? And sometimes the most important thing, especially if it's an author that writes a series, the most important thing that's leading into his next book or her next book may be in those final couple of paragraphs. We have a tendency to do that with Bible stories as well. Okay, he's kicked out of the temple, move on, next story. That's kind of how we go. But no, the meat is actually right here. Because The Pharisees investigate. They throw out this young man out of the temple. And it is here that Jesus approaches him with a foundational and very important question that we should never, ever forget. It's in verse 35. In verse 35, Jesus heard that they had thrown him out. They found him, searched for him, and said, "Do you believe in the Son of Man?" It's a very blunt question. Because you see, believe here is an action word. And what Jesus is really asking him, are you persuaded of the truth and existence of the Son of Man? Is this something that you fully agree with and believe in? Tell me. With this question, Jesus starts moving from head knowledge, which is very, very easy for most of us, to the heart. You could rewrite it by saying, what is your heart telling you about the Son of Man right now, young man? And he was a younger man, not entirely old, but he was old enough that he was able to be kicked out of the temple. So we know that he was over the age of 12. Because at the age of 12, males become members of the temple after they have their bar mitzvah. So we know that he was younger. You see, because too often we think a little bit too hard about questions that Jesus asks. We think, but we don't try to discern. This is really a discernment question that Jesus is asking. Now, what is discernment? Well, I spent close to 7 years working on a dissertation that looked at that as the heart of spiritual growth and spiritual development as a leader or as a person of faith within the church. How do we discern? And one of my favorite professors was Dr. Elizabeth Liebert. And in her book, The Way of Discernment, Spiritual Practices for Decision Making, because Jesus is asking this man to make a decision. She writes this, that in the Christian spiritual tradition, discernment refers to the process of sifting out what is of God, discriminating between that which expresses God's call and anything that runs counter to it. Jesus is asking this young man, put everything you know into a sifter right now. Most of us remember the old one that your mom would give you or your grandma would give you that you had to use like this. Not this one. This was the easy one. The hard one was the grippy one. Because eventually you'd have to go to the other hand, and then eventually you'd have to use two. And for some reason, there was always a 30-pound of flour that needed to be sifted. Maybe because I was the youngest. I don't know. But think about that for a minute. Everything that's going on in the world right now, hopefully you watch more than one news source. Because if you don't, when you sift it, you get everything else out the same. But we need to sift what's coming in. And Jesus is telling him, come on, don't think as the world thinks. Give me your answer. What are you feeling right here? And that's what discernment really is. Discernment is you've spent enough time with God that you've got this connection between your head and your heart, and you're able to know what's of God and what's not of God. See, that's what our prayer is for a young Christian. They don't have that skill set yet. Their sifter isn't big enough. They have the really small sifter. The older we get, the bigger our sifter gets because there's more junk that's coming in. And we need to sift it out and know what's knowing of God. So I loved when Dr. Liebert did this and phrased this, because it is so foundational to the Christian life. We're sifting these things out. And as a leader within the church, that's what we're called to do. What is the right path for a church to take? If we aren't sifting out the world to get down to what God really wants us to do, we haven't done our due diligence. And it's the same for you and me as we sit on a daily basis in God's Word, sifting out the world so that we get what God is wanting us to see out of here. That is very, very powerful. So she says that discernment is the process of intentionally becoming aware of how God is present, active, and calling us as individuals and communities that we can respond with increasingly greater faithfulness. Young man, sift out everything, even your parents. Hate to say that, yes, we're parents, but eventually our children need to learn and grow and discern on their own, just as we had to. And that's what God is telling this young man. He's asking him to sift through everything to find the truth that God has waiting for him. He is asking us to do the same. Do we actually believe this? Why we're here today? Do we actually believe this? Or are we just here because this is part of the cool club? Early on in ministry, there was the thing on, are you a country club Christian or are you a real Christian? And that was kind of the thought that was out there. You'd hear a lot of pastors sharing that was out there. Not original. Jesus was asking, have you discerned? Have you gotten all the stuff out of the way so that you can actually hear me and see me? So we have this question about the meaning of belief, and that's what belief is. It's the sifting out of all the junk to get down right to the heart of God in our lives. Now Jesus is going to say, what's the location then of that belief? You're going to get a meaning. Now you're going to get the location. Because this man is excited by Jesus' question. I'm just sitting here going, wow, that'd be so cool. I mean, I'm loving right now the fourth graders, doing Bible study with the fourth graders over at AGC, because they've got tons of questions. Tons of questions. Now, I've been teaching long enough to know that questions can deviate the pastor from being able to do the lesson plan that he has. I've been doing this for 40 years. So I know when their question is kind of one that's just out there, like how many angels dance on the head of a pin type of question, you know? So I'll guide them gently back into the discussion that I'm wanting to do. But they're excited. I don't have to ask them for questions. And I think when we lose that excitement as believers is when we've got a spiritual crisis going on in our lives. Because you all should be excited about coming to church. Not because of me, but because you're meeting with him. And if you're not excited, then that's when we start doing this. We start looking what's going on. And so the man's excited. He feels a connection to Jesus. He just can't place his finger on why. Why am I so connected to this guy? Why does this question not offend me? You know, I may have been blind, but I'm not stupid. You know, that's kind of what he's saying on here. You know, I may not have been able to see, but I still have mind. But there's something that's drawing me. Why am I? Why am I so excited? The man is starting to feel that there is hope for him. Churches should be full here in the next few weeks, not because it's Easter, but because we're the only place that can offer hope in a world right now that's just going crazy. Whether it's internationally, nationally, locally, whatever it is. Right now, this is where people need to be. And this man has a profound question to ask back to Jesus. And it's seen in verse 36. He says, "Who is he, sir?" the man asked. "Tell me, so that I may believe in him." The man's spiritual eyes are starting to open. You know, when we read of the account of Paul on the road to Emmaus, what happened? The scales came off of his eyes and he was able to see again. This is what's happening with this man. Physically, yes, he can see, but there's still spiritual scales on his eyes and they're starting to come off. This is exciting. Those of you who have ever had cataract surgery, isn't it exciting to finally see stuff again? Yes, you can see, but it's like it's barely a hand in front of me. And then you have your cataract surgery and boom, everything's clear again. That's what's, this man's having spiritual cataract surgery. He needs to place his new eyes upon this individual physically, he says. He needs confirmation of who this person is. And Jesus reveals it. Jesus reveals it. In verse 37, when he says, "You have now seen him. In fact, he is the one speaking to you." Y'all ever met somebody famous? and you weren't quite sure because they were kind of dressed not like they normally do in their famous type of stuff. Maybe it was an actor, somebody, that you finally met. And then when you finally realize it, you're like sitting here going, oh my gosh, they're sitting at the table over there. And you're like sitting here, everyone's going crazy. And you're so excited because now it's connected. I knew I should know that person. He's in baggy sweats. He looks good in that. You're sitting here, but it's this excitement that's there. He has the excitement again. His spiritual eyes, you can almost hear it. He's let out a huge sigh. Whew, man, I thought somebody healed me. I didn't quite know it was because I couldn't see him, but now I see him. The excitement is there. He's finally found the one he's been looking for all of this time. His dream of seeing anyone has been made possible by the Son of Man, and this man, the Son of Man, is looking right at him. When you come to the Lord's table today, think about that. Yes, this is symbolism, but in a way, think if Jesus was handing you these elements, you'd have the same feeling today. This is excitement, everybody. He has been located. But the head knowledge of the Son of Man is also now moving into the man's heart. Imagine that. He's finally connecting. The dots are coming together. Heart knowledge, head knowledge, boom. Everything happens. These words have penetrated the man's heart, and all of the dots are connected. The physical dots are connected. Now the spiritual dots are connected. See, belief, the meaning of it, the location of it is happening. It has all come together. But now we hear Jesus explain of why he was correcting this man's vision. How he corrects our vision. I was gifted with my first pair of glasses in 3rd grade. I say that kind of snarkily right now because I did not want glasses in 3rd grade. But I love to read, and the books, my arm just was not long enough to be able to see what I was being asked to read. And so I got my first pair of glasses. And kind of like they did with me with progressives, those wonderful trifocals that they give you nowadays. Back then they said, well, Doug, you're going to need bifocals because you read a lot, and this will help you read better. Okay, I go home. What I didn't expect was the pain of going to school the next day. Because I went from being normal with 2 eyes to being called 4 eyes or 6 eyes if they figured out that I had bifocals. Because back then they could see that you had the line in there. There was no lines in, now there's no lines, so you can't tell that. And so tell a 3rd grader now that he just went from being normal to being the weird kid wearing glasses. Thank God there was another friend, actually 2 friends within a few weeks that also had to join, so we had our own little club. But anyhow, why did I need them? Because I couldn't see. My vision was bad. Now we have ways of having surgery, and everything else and stuff going on. But I needed to have my vision corrected. And it was the only way available at that time to correct it was through glasses. When we believe that Jesus is the Son of God, our vision gets corrected. Our vision is corrected, both physically and spiritually. We now see the world around us differently than we did before. Think back to that. If you came to Christ as an adult, the world looks totally different now. For those of us who came to Christ when we were little kids, we kind of got to think about it a little bit. But even if you come to Christ as a little kid, there's times that you kind of flatline a little bit. You're not living for Christ and everything. So we can look back there. But our vision is changed. And the man in our story has just completed that transition. But Jesus had others that were listening. He always did. Nothing he ever did was in a vacuum. And they were listening to the conversation, and they were observing what he was doing, and he needed to clarify a few things for them. The man has had his vision corrected and can go out into the world as a changed man. So what does he do? Verse 38. He said, Lord, I believe. and he worshiped him. Answer, response. When you come to know Christ, the first thing you want to do is worship. That's the first thing you want to do is worship. This man is now ready to move on. He is ready to move on. The man worships Jesus and he leaves. We don't hear any more about him in the story. But those who are left, they needed to hear something. And Jesus presents the dual nature of what he's been called to do. In verse 39, when he says, "For judgment I have come into the world so that the blind will see, and those who see will become blind." What is the dualism that he's presenting here? Well, it's salvation and judgment. Christ came to bring salvation. Those who don't accept his message, they accept judgment. That is what is usually so hard about people coming to know Jesus Christ. That's the hardest thing about it. Well, what do you mean if I don't accept him, I'm not going to heaven? Well, that's kind of the rules that they put down there. That to have eternal life, you have to believe in the one who gives it. And hopefully you're talking to them not on the deathbed where they don't have a lot of time left to be able to mull over that. But that is the hardest rub on there for people to get. The man born blind received his gift. But there were a few left that did not understand. You see, the Pharisees hear this story and they quickly chime in. They want to make sure that they're still good with God. They still have their little secret decoder ring, but Jesus is very blunt with them, and I'm sure they did not like his response. You see, they had a problem with humility. Go figure, right? Pharisees and humility. And while they knew in their heads, they didn't know Jesus yet in their hearts. And that's why he closes with the last verse where he says, "If you were blind, you would not be guilty of sin. But now that you claim you can see, your guilt remains." They hadn't accepted Jesus yet in their lives. Their guilt was still there. No matter how good they thought they were, it was still there. And so that is what makes sharing the gospel sometimes very, very hard. Because some will stay as hard-hearted as the Pharisees did. And others, like the man born blind, will realize, what a gift I have been given. I am so thankful. Praise Jesus. And they go on and share that. That is our goal. We individually can never make anyone accept Jesus Christ. All we can do, and all I'm asking that we do as a body of believers, is go out and share that message so that God can then do the total work of removing the scales from their eyes and opening their hearts to him. That means that we are seen as we believe. Amen.